Imagine waking up in a quiet colonial village where nothing seems unusual. But behind closed doors, fear is growing. A whisper here, a rumor there. Something unseen is beginning to spread. And then, everything changes. People start pointing fingers, accusing their neighbors, their friends, even their own families. No solid proof, no real evidence, just fear turning into belief. In the year 16, Salem Village, a small colonial settlement in Massachusetts. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Wooden homes scattered across frozen fields, smoke rising from chimneys, and families trying to survive harsh winters. Life here was not easy, but it was predictable. People worked hard, prayed harder, and believed deeply that their world was always under spiritual watch. In this society, religion was not just faith, it was law. Every illness, every accident, every failure in harvest was often seen as a sign of something darker. The devil was not just a story here. He was believed to be real and constantly trying to corrupt innocent souls. Because of this belief, fear lived quietly inside every home. But it was controlled, contained, almost normal. Until the balance began to break. Small tensions between families started growing. Old arguments refused to die, and mistrust slowly spread through the village like a shadow. No one knew it yet, but Salem was becoming the perfect place for something dangerous. A place where fear could easily turn into belief, and belief could turn into accusation.
It began quietly, in a small house at the edge of Salem Village. Two young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, began behaving strangely. At first, it looked harmless. Restlessness, trouble sleeping, sudden fear. But soon, it became something far worse. They would scream without warning, fall to the ground, and twist their bodies as if something invisible was hurting them. Doctors were called, but no illness could be found. No fever, no injury, nothing. And yet, the symptoms continued, growing more intense each day. The village did not understand what they were seeing. Some said it was illness, others said it was deception. But one idea began to spread faster than all others. Fear, once it enters a community, never stays silent for long. Soon, the question changed. It was no longer what is happening. It became who is responsible. The strange behavior of the girls demanded answers. And in Salem, answers did not need proof. Only belief. Under pressure from the village, the girls were asked a dangerous question. Who is hurting you? Slowly, names began to appear. Neighbors, servants, outcasts, people who were already seen as different. Once a name was spoken, it could not be taken back. Accusation became reality, even without evidence. And the village began to break apart from within.
Once the accusations began, Salem changed forever. Words were no longer just words. They became evidence. And evidence did not need proof. It only needed fear. Soon, the authorities began arresting those who were accused. One by one, people were taken from their homes. Sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes in front of their families. No proper defense, no real trial, only accusation and authority. The accused were taken to crowded prisons, dark, cold, and suffocating. Many had done nothing wrong, but innocence did not protect them anymore. Because in Salem, fear had replaced justice. And the more people were arrested, the more the village believed. By the spring of 1692, Salem was no longer controlled by reason. It was controlled by fear. The courtrooms became crowded, filled with terrified villagers, anxious families, and judges desperate to find evil among them. But these were not normal trials. The accused were often denied basic rights, and the evidence used against them was something almost impossible to defend against. Spectral evidence. People claimed they could see invisible spirits attacking them. They pointed at innocent men and women, screaming that their souls were being tortured by witches. And somehow, the court inside Salem's prisons, fear was becoming unbearable. The cells were freezing cold, overcrowded, and filled with people who had no idea if they would survive. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Some prisoners became sick. Others began losing hope completely. And then, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. Those who denied witchcraft often remained imprisoned or faced execution. But those who confessed sometimes survived, even if the confession was false. Suddenly, innocent people faced an impossible choice: tell the truth and risk death, or confess to crimes they never committed just to stay alive. Some broke under pressure. They admitted to impossible things, speaking of dark rituals, strange spirits, and meetings with the devil. As the months passed, Salem stopped feeling like a village. It became something colder, something fearful. Trust disappeared almost overnight. Neighbors who had known each other for years suddenly looked at one another with suspicion. Simple arguments, old grudges, even personal jealousy could now become deadly weapons. Because all someone had to do was accuse another person of witchcraft. And once the accusation was spoken, fear would do the rest. families began turning against each other. Husbands accused wives. Children accused parents. Friends testified against friends. By the summer of 1692, Salem's prisons were overflowing. The accused were packed into dark wooden cells, chained together, surrounded by sickness, fear, and uncertainty. Some prisoners had been locked away for months. They barely saw sunlight anymore. Food was limited. The air inside the cells felt cold and damp. And every single day, they waited to learn whether they would live or die. Many prisoners were elderly. Some were weak from illness. Others slowly broke under the emotional pressure. The guards treated them like criminals, even before any real evidence had been proven. But perhaps the cruelest part was the uncertainty. Nobody knew who would be accused next. Every knock on the prison door created panic. Some prisoners prayed constantly, begging God to save them. Others sat silently in darkness, too exhausted to even speak anymore. Outside the prison walls, the hysteria. Eventually, Salem's hysteria reached its most terrifying stage. Executions began. The accused were led from their prison cells through silent crowds toward a place known as Gallows Hill. Some prayed quietly as they walked. Others cried in fear, insisting until the very end that they were innocent. But by this point, Salem no longer cared about innocence. The fear had become too powerful. To many villagers, these executions felt necessary. They believed they were protecting their community from evil. And that belief made the tragedy even darker. Men and women were publicly hanged, while terrified crowds watched in silence. Families. But eventually, even Salem could not ignore the truth forever. The accusations had spread too far. Too many innocent people had suffered. Too many families had been destroyed. And slowly, cracks began to appear in the hysteria. Some villagers started questioning the trials. Others wondered how invisible visions and strange accusations had become enough to sentence people to death. Even respected leaders inside the colony began growing uncomfortable with what Salem had become. Because by now, fear was no longer targeting only outsiders. It was threatening everyone. The panic that once united the town was now tearing it apart. Judges who once accepted spectral evidence slowly began rejecting it. Public support for the trials weakened, and eventually, the execution stopped. But for many people, it was already far too late. 19 innocent people had been hanged. Others died inside prison cells, weak, sick, and forgotten. Entire families were left traumatized by fear and loss. Salem would never fully recover from what had happened there. Years later,
Many involved in the trials expressed guilt and regret. Some jurors publicly apologized. Others admitted the hysteria had consumed their judgment. But apologies could not undo the damage. The dead would not return. And the fear that once controlled Salem had already become part of history forever. Today, the Salem Witch Trials are remembered not as proof of witchcraft, but as a terrifying warning.
More than 3 centuries later, Salem remains a warning, not about witches, but about what fear can make ordinary people do.